I'm David Cot, host of New History of Spain, and this is episode 3 titled Prehistory of the Iberian Peninsula. In this episode, I will provide you with an overview of prehistory in the world and Europe as understood by contemporary researchers. We will take a look at the origins of humanity and states, and you will learn about the prehistory of the Iberian Peninsula from the Paleolithic to the early Bronze Age. The origin of humanity. Prehistory is paradoxically both the longest period of humanity and the least known, precisely because there was no writing, which is what allows us to speak of history as such. Prehistory spans from the appearance of Australopithecus more than 4 million years ago to the creation of writing in the Near East around 3300 BC. But for the Iberian Peninsula, it does not end until centuries later. While prehistory is not my primary field of expertise or interest, I aim to convey the current consensus among researchers on this vast period. However, it should be noted that our understanding of prehistory can change significantly, since established paradigms for understanding the origin of humanity and its evolution are based on few archaeological samples and human remains, especially when it comes to the first humans. So it will not be surprising if, in a few years, hypotheses that are accepted today become outdated. With that said, the origin of the human being is framed in the slow process of evolution from animal species that began millions of years ago from simpler living organisms. Humans are part of the family of primate mammals known as great apes or hominids, which includes species such as chimpanzees, orangutans, or gorillas. In fact, the genetic difference between a chimpanzee and a modern human is just over 1%. But that 1% is key to making us a more intelligent species with abstract and complex thinking. More data is needed, but it is believed that between 6 and 8 million years ago, there existed the last common ancestor shared between chimpanzees and humans. And it is from then on that our most direct ancestors appeared. While some consider possible earlier species, the first hominid that is confirmed to have walked on 2 legs and played a major role in the birth of modern humans were the Australopithecus, who lived in Africa about 4 million years ago. About 2.5 million years ago, the first Homo species appeared, classically defined by their ability to make stone tools. Fossils of the Homo genus dating back about 1.8 million years have been found outside Africa, marking the appearance of differentiated human ancestors. This leads me to a fundamental question. Where did modern humans, the Homo sapiens, come from? There have been 2 traditional models, the out of Africa theory and the multi-regional theory. The out of Africa model proposes that all humans have a common origin in Africa, emerging about 300,000 years ago with a capacity for language, abstraction, and more complex thought than other human ancestors. Several waves of these Homo sapiens will have left Africa. Hence, genetics observe fewer genetic variations among non-African humans. And they will have populated the rest of the continents, completely replacing and not mixing with Homo ancestors like Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. In contrast, according to the multi-regional theory, modern humans emerged parallelly from a common ancestor from 1 or 2 million years ago. There were genetic mixtures among populations from different regions, but at the same time, local and differentiated characteristics were maintained that will explain the ethnic differences among humans. However, genetic evidence refuted the multi-regional theory, and almost everyone seemed to accept the recent African origin of modern humans. Well, this was the case until in the last 2 decades, the classic out of Africa model, without nuances, was also refuted. What is the correct hypothesis then? Based on genetic evidence, the out of Africa theory had to be nuanced to recognize that. Although between 92 and 98% of Homo sapiens genetics does derive from African ancestors, modern humans from outside Africa also have some Neanderthal or Denisovan genes. Therefore, some aspects of the multi-regional theory were indeed correct, because non-African humans also descend from regional variants of archaic humans that ultimately went extinct, but that were not evolutionary dead ends as it was previously thought. To make an analogy, imagine a large river that represents Homo sapiens flowing out of Africa. This large river flows into other continents, and some of the water of rivers representing the Neanderthals or the Denisovans merge into the Homo sapiens river that ultimately is the only one that continues to exist. While the main flow is still from Africa, it carries traces of small rivers it had encountered outside of Africa, thus influencing the makeup of the water, that is, of modern humans. The summary is that the evolution of humanity leading to modern humans did not follow a linear or unique path. Paleolithic in the Iberian Peninsula. The Paleolithic, meaning Old Stone Age, is the longest phase in the history of humanity. It begins with the first known use of stone tools around 2.6 million years ago and continues until about 12,000 BC in the Iberian Peninsula. Understandably, such a long period is divided into three parts. The first one is the Lower Paleolithic, characterized by the emergence and extinction of multiple human species and the use of simple stone tools. About 120,000 years ago, the Middle Paleolithic began, marked by the dominance of Neanderthals, the use of fire, and the sophistication of tools, with the use of stone in more sophisticated manners such as knives, awls, or drills. Finally, we have the Upper Paleolithic, which began in Iberia around 35 to 40,000 years ago and is characterized by the triumph of Homo sapiens. With modern humans, creativity was unleashed with the development of art, religious beliefs, and more advanced tools. It was during this time that stone and bone bows and arrows, hooks, and harpoons appeared, a complete prehistoric arsenal. Europe was a very different place back then, home to elephants, rhinoceroses, and lions, and northern and much of Central Europe was covered in snow and ice. This is one of the reasons why early humans used caves as shelters, as the outdoors presented all sorts of dangers, and they could also obtain flint for tools, utensils, and stone hunting weapons. Homo species lived as nomads and hunter-gatherers, meaning they had no fixed settlement, lived off gathering plants, fruits, or mollusks, and the animals and fish they hunted, and they were also scavengers and even cannibals. Archaeological evidence has challenged the traditional binary view of seeing hunter-gatherer societies from the Paleolithic as universally egalitarian, in contrast to Neolithic societies where agriculture, livestock breeding, a sedentary lifestyle, and state formation were behind the origin of economic and gender inequalities. Some hunter-gatherer societies were equal as far as we can observe by the material evidence, but some were not, like the Upper Paleolithic society of Sangar in Russia or Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Were Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies generally much more egalitarian than later agrarian societies? Certainly, because there was little to own and accumulate given that bands were generally small and mobile. But that does not mean that there were no leaderships, social differences, differences in access to resources such as food, or sexual division of labor. For example, hunting large animals was generally a male task in the European Paleolithic, while women were more dedicated to gathering and hunting smaller animals. This can be observed in bones, since there are more elbow injuries in men than in women, injuries associated with the throwing of spears and other hunting weapons. The point I'm trying to make is that there have been unequal societies without agriculture and agricultural societies without inequality, and that the inevitable and linear progression from a primitive egalitarian society to a complex hierarchical one is an oversimplified and flawed understanding of human history. But back to the Iberian Peninsula, the oldest remains of a homogeneous species in Europe were found at the most famous archaeological site in Spain, Atapuerca, in the province of Burgos. The remains date back to 1.2 million years ago and have not yet been identified with the known species. and at that site they discovered the species of Homo antecessor dated to about 780,000 years ago. Besides these species, in the prolific prehistoric site of Atapuerca, archaeologists found species such as Homo heidelbergensis, or the much more recent remains of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Regarding how these early humans arrived in the Iberian Peninsula, the most accepted theory today suggests they migrated through the Pyrenees Mountains, though some also crossed the Straits of Gibraltar from Africa. About 200,000 years ago, Neanderthals began to move to the peninsula, and they did not disappear until 28,000 years ago, according to the remains found in Gibraltar. That means that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted for thousands of years, since modern humans were present in the Iberian Peninsula 40,000 years ago, which only further supports what genetics tell us, that there was some degree of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Along with France, the Iberian Peninsula is one of the most important regions in the world in terms of Upper Paleolithic cave paintings. And I say that because I cannot do this episode without mentioning the famous Altamira cave. The cave of Altamira was discovered in 1868 in the province of Cantabria. Famous for its stunning polychromatic paintings of bison, horses and deer, some dating back 36,000 years, the cave was sealed naturally by a rockslide around 13,000 years ago, which helped preserve these prehistoric artworks in exceptional condition. Today, only a few visitors each year get the chance to see these incredible paintings, and hopefully what you see if you are watching this video is enough to feel joy. Mesolithic in the Iberian Peninsula. Around 12,000 BC, a significant climate change known as the Ellerod Oscillation marked the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the current period, the Holocene. As the climate warmed up, humans faced the extinction of large animals like mammoths, which led them to hunt smaller animals and expand their diets to include, for instance, more shellfish and fish. When the temperature rise ended around 10,000 BC, the era of humans trying to dominate the environment began, with Homo sapiens dispersing across all continents, and the abundance of resources favoring their demographic expansion. This is the environmentalist theory, which focuses on the climate as the driver for the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. However, there are theories that offer different perspectives. One, inspired by Malthus, suggests that growing populations push humans to explore new living strategies. On the other hand, Barbara Bender's theory emphasizes the importance of the collective decisions and actions of groups, who decided whether or not to adopt agriculture based on their local circumstances and internal power dynamics. In this transition period from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, called the Mesolithic, the tools in the Iberian Peninsula showed regional differences and became more specialized than those used in the earlier Upper Paleolithic. In the Mesolithic, some groups started settling down more without becoming fully sedentary, moving less frequently and focusing more on controlling their territories. An exciting aspect of this period is the rock art found across the Spanish Mediterranean basin, particularly in Valencia and Aragon. This region boasts over 700 caves, the largest collection of Mesolithic art in Europe, recognized as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. The art from this time not only features animals, but also human figures. These paintings depict everyday activities such as using honey to lure and hunt animals, scenes of conflict and dancing, and even show that people were using skirts and masks. Neolithic in the Iberian Peninsula. The Neolithic period marked a major shift from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to settled agrarian societies, although this transition was neither linear nor smooth. People began farming and raising livestock, initially as a supplement to their diets and eventually as their main food supply. For the first time, humans attempted to transform the environment and shape it to their liking to suit their needs. And this is how humans gradually abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and caves to become sedentary in open-air settlements. This implied a significant change in mindset because humans placed themselves above other species and the natural environment. The past 10,000 years of human history can be summarized as the story of sedentary farmers and ranchers replacing nomadic hunter-gatherers. This leads me to the secret question of the episode to answer in the YouTube comments or some podcast directories. And this also helps me check how many of you are actually paying attention. Do you think the first farmers and ranchers will regret the problems caused by sedentary life in the long run? I look forward to your response in the comments, and while you are at it, I remind you that you can subscribe to the YouTube channel and podcast New History of Spain, and you can help me continue with the show if you like my content by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/newhistoryspain. Picking up where we left off, the Neolithic began around 8500 BC in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East in modern-day Iraq. And it began there not because it had the most fertile soil, but because it was one of the regions with the greatest access to domesticable plants and animals. Eurasia was home to more species that could be domesticated compared to Africa, the Americas, or Oceania, which partly explains the differences in economic development between continents. The Neolithic did not begin in the Iberian Peninsula until around 5600 BC, and Iberian Mesolithic communities did not switch to a sedentary and agrarian life at the same time. There were very different paces with centuries of separation, with the first evidence on the eastern coast of the Iberian Peninsula in the Valencian region, later on the Atlantic coast, and finally in the Ebro Valley, the Cantabrian coast, and the Inner Plateau, where no Neolithic communities are observable until between 5300 and 4900 BC. This raises the question of how the adoption of agriculture and livestock occurred. The diffusionist thesis that claimed that it was slowly spread from the Near East to the rest of the world has become outdated because agriculture and sedentary lifestyles appeared independently in different places around the world. In the end, humans think alike everywhere since we are the same species. In the Balkans and Eastern Europe, there is genetic evidence confirming that the spread of agriculture occurred through the colonization of farmers. In contrast, in the Iberian Peninsula, genetic data indicates minimal influence from these migrations, with less than 20% of the genes coming from outside populations since the Upper Paleolithic. The initial appearance of agriculture along the coastlines suggests influences from external contacts or possibly newcomers by sea. Yet, for most of the peninsula, the move toward a farming lifestyle was driven by the local hunter-gatherer groups themselves. Since we are talking about communications, it is worth mentioning a study published in 2023 that revealed that Baltic amber was found in late Neolithic burials, from around 3000 BC, in a cave near Terrassa, Barcelona. It was an important finding because it is the oldest evidence of amber from the Baltic region in Western Europe. And it shows that, despite how testimonial this trade may have been, there were long-distance trade networks capable of carrying exotic and decorative products from one end of Europe to another in such an ancient period. From the Iberian Neolithic, we have very well-preserved necklaces, bracelets, rings, combs, spoons, and even Sparto sandals. The Neolithic also brought a change in religious beliefs, as humans began to represent gods and perform all kinds of rituals to give birth or have a good harvest. Neolithic men painted schematically, in caves and more frequently on portable objects such as amulets that were believed to give them luck and protection. While caves were still used for shelter, the Neolithic era also saw the emergence of the first villages with circular adobe houses. The construction of dolmens and the manufacture of pottery, which began around 4800 BC, were crucial developments. Pottery was particularly important as it allowed for the storage of food and water, essential for sustaining larger, more settled communities. As societies became more hierarchical, the first forms of organized political structures beyond simple tribal systems began to appear, including chiefdoms, and beyond the Iberian Peninsula, city-states, kingdoms, and even empires developed. The Neolithic period marked the beginning of growing social inequalities. We observe greater gender inequalities in the Iberian Neolithic in the disproportion of burials of men compared to those found of women, the more frequent depiction of men in rock art, and in the growing association of men with violence observed in men with traumatic injuries or buried with weapons. Health also declined compared to the Paleolithic era, as the transition to a sedentary agrarian lifestyle led to less varied and less nutritious diets. If this new way of life was so bad, why did agriculture and livestock triumph over hunting and gathering? There are several interpretations. The most positive one is that agriculture and livestock have two main advantages. They can feed many more people, and they are a safer option because the food produced can be stored and people don't have to be constantly on the move in search of food that they may or may not find. Another interpretation, influenced by Malthusian thought, suggests that human pressure on the environment caused the abundant natural resources to be depleted, and it became desirable to secure food for a growing population. And yet another one is more perverse and suggests that it benefited a few at the expense of an oppressed majority, since it is always important that you ask yourself who benefits from what, because nothing ever benefits everyone, and certainly not equally. The origin of states. Political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott, in his book Against the Grain, challenges the common belief that people choose to live as sedentary farmers because it was a safer lifestyle. He suggests that the first sedentary communities were often formed under the influence of a rising social elite. These elites had military skills, controlled vital resources like land and food, conducted religious rites to justify their power, and demanded labor from others. Scott argues that these leaders did not just force people into this lifestyle through threats, but rather they created conditions that made sedentary life and agriculture desirable to ensure their survival. All that despite the disadvantages of this socioeconomic model in creating inequalities, worsening nutrition and health, and increasing the risk of illness, and that the establishment of these early states could be associated with forced labor and slavery. Thus, not only were animals and plants domesticated in the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to sedentary ones, but humans were also domesticated, becoming more submissive and vulnerable. Others, like David Graeber, provide a more positive view and emphasize that there is evidence of early agrarian societies without visible inequality. He also argues that people's agency was important in shaping societies, that the origin of states is also linked to the ability of certain groups or individuals to institutionalize power, and that societies could oscillate between hierarchical and more egalitarian structures based on changing social, environmental, or economic conditions. There is broad academic consensus that cereals such as wheat, barley, and rice were critical in the origin of states, because they are easy to grow, transport, store, and redistribute. This made cereals well suited for tax collection and facilitated the development of a much more hierarchical society with an elite capable of extracting resources and controlling their redistribution. By forcing people to pay tribute in cereals, they were incentivized to abandon the cultivation of other crops that might have been preferable for families. This was also studied by an economics professor I had, Luigi Pascali, in his paper The Origin of the State, Land Productivity or Appropriability. There, he convincingly demonstrated that the origin of states and the differences in the complexity of political entities by region did not depend on an increase in productivity and the existence of production surpluses as had been claimed until recently. On the contrary, the determining factor in the formation of states and their complexity was the transition to the production of more appropriable foodstuffs, which could therefore be subject to taxation or theft. Well, some will say that taxing is nothing less than legitimized theft. And this is not far from the truth, because promoting the agriculture of appropriable cereals is indeed a mafia-like method of artificially generating a relationship of dependence. It was like saying, either you pay me and I guarantee your security, or face the consequences. In any case, the appropriability of crops explains why in regions where cereal cultivation is more suitable, estates were more likely formed. While in regions with few types of domesticable cereals available and with soil more suitable for cultivating tubers and root vegetables, estates did not form or less complex political entities and hierarchies appeared, as was the case in Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Australia. The Copper Age. The Copper Age, also known as the Chalcolithic, marks the transition from the Stone Age to the Age of Metals. This period began around the 3rd millennium BC in the Iberian Peninsula, around 3000 BC or slightly later. And during this time, humans developed a fascination for shiny objects and began to extract and work with metals like copper, silver, and gold. These metals were sought after over stone, which had obvious limitations for certain uses. While writing was invented in Mesopotamia between 3500 and 3000 BC, the Iberian Peninsula continued to remain in prehistory for many more centuries. In the Copper Age, the use of metals was mostly limited to creating objects of prestige. Stone utensils and tools were still more common. Beyond the technological advancements that the Copper Age represents by marking the beginning of metalworking, this era was crucial for the impact metals had on social structures and the rise of the first urban centers in the Iberian Peninsula. From the late Neolithic period, the practice of building large stone funerary structures with collective burials spread across Western Europe, a cultural phenomenon known as megalithic art, although individual burials and cave burials were still practiced. Also, during this time and continuing into the early Bronze Age, the material culture known as the bell-becker culture spread across Europe. Characterized by its bell-shaped vessels, this archaeological culture used such pottery in daily life for drinking or entertaining guests, as well as in individual burials. In the Copper Age, we already find relatively large populations protected by walls such as Zambujal in Portugal or Los Millares in Almería, which had an estimated population of between 1,000 and 1,500 inhabitants. From the site of Los Millares comes the name of the culture of the region, one of the most important ones in the Iberian Peninsula at the time, between 3200 and 2200 BC. The culture of Los Millares was characterized by fortified settlements, megalithic art, and an unequal society. The settlement of Los Millares consisted of a walled enclosure of 6 hectares with 4 distinct lines of walls and several forts, which seems to indicate that it engaged in war with neighboring settlements on multiple occasions. The economic backbone of Los Millares was agriculture and livestock, with metallurgy also having its importance as there already existed a division of labor in the metalworking process. The grave goods from Los Millares show that social differences were marked, despite the fact that burials were collective. It is revealing that in the grave goods there were few metal objects and items made of ivory, bone, and stone were more common. Interestingly, the settlements of the culture of Los Millares were located near fertile farming lands rather than near mines, which reminds us that a generalized use of metals had not yet happened, and that this only occurred in the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age. The Bronze Age spans from 2200 to 750 BC in the Iberian Peninsula. This era saw people mixing copper with other metals like tin to create bronze, a much stronger material than copper. Metal use really took off during this time, and that promoted trade and migrations and benefited regions with abundant mineral resources. The Bronze Age marked a significant progress in metallurgical techniques, intensified trade, and significant social and economic changes. The beginning of the Bronze Age is marked by the 4.2 kiloyear event, one of the most significant climatic events in human history, characterized by rapid and abrupt climate change. In the Mediterranean basin, it made the climate colder and drier, with severe droughts that led to the collapse of states and civilizations, migrations, and other social disruptions. In some places, like northwestern Iberia, people migrated right after this climate shock. In the southwest and along Portugal's Atlantic coast, this depopulation happened more gradually, starting around 2500 BC, and it took a whole millennium for populations to bounce back. In the Meseta Central or Inner Plateau, we can observe significant changes in material culture, settlement forms, and burial practices after this climatic event as they move into the Bronze Age. But the north and northeast stayed pretty much the same throughout the 3rd millennium BC. This was not because these regions were isolated or backwards, but because they were more unaffected by these environmental changes, so it was unnecessary for them to drastically change their lifestyle. The southeast is where we really see things shaking up, and oddly enough, it is in a dry region where life and activities seem to carry on without a hitch, even though the climate event should have hit hard. It is here where the more hierarchical society and a state-like formation of the early Iberian Bronze Age developed, the Argaric civilization, but I will discuss that in more detail in the next section. On another note, a Harvard study looked at the DNA of the people who lived in the Iberian Peninsula for 8,000 years. Following this study, some headlines made it sound like there was a big invasion during the Bronze Age, even a genocide, in which newcomers from the Ukrainian steppes known as Yamnayas allegedly killed local men and took their women. A narrative that reminds me of some current far-right conspiracy narratives against immigrants. The study found that about 40% of the local genes changed because of these new guys from the steppe, who probably migrated because of the big climate crisis of the 4.2 kilo year. Here is the thing though. The study only relies on 271 individuals, and only 60 from the Bronze Age. With such a small sample and other methodological issues like the fact that individuals following burial rites such as cremation being excluded from any genetic study, we should be careful before jumping to conclusions. There is also no evidence of widespread violence or a significant cultural shift as one would expect if such an invasion and massacre had occurred, so we can disregard that theory. The real reason geneticists and anthropologists have found to explain the decline in genetic diversity from the male line is social changes that affected reproduction. Men tended to stay in one place and inherit property, while women moved around, leading to a few male lineages having more children who spread their DNA far and wide. This all started before the steppe folks even arrived, so the whole genocide in prehistory thing is sensationalist nonsense. The Bronze Age is split into 3 parts: Early Bronze from 2200 to 1550 BC, Middle Bronze from 1550 to 1200 BC, and Late Bronze from 1200 to 750 BC. I won't get into the nitty-gritty because I want to focus on the Argaric culture coming up next, but after that culture fell in the southeast, it took a while before any other society in the peninsula matched its political and economic complexity, not until the Tartessians came along. Around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean suffered from turmoil with lots of civilizations collapsing before the late Bronze Age, for reasons we still don't fully grasp. Back in Iberia during the Middle Bronze Age, people left poor soils and built stronger fortified places. By the late Bronze Age, they had really nailed down how to work with bronze, build up hierarchical societies and chiefdoms, and intensify trading overseas with the arrival of the first Phoenician traders and settlers from the Levant region. The Argaric civilization. El Argar, near today's Vera in Almeria, is an ancient site that lent its name to a culture influencing a vast area in southeastern Spain. Founded around 2050 BC, El Argar was a fortified settlement housing about 500 people, although this was not the largest Argaric settlement, since for instance, La Bastida de Totana in Murcia had a population of between 600 and 800 people. The Vera Valley had roughly 3,500 inhabitants during the early Bronze Age, to give you an idea of the population sizes we are talking about. The larger Argaric communities, perched on hills, were economic hubs with workshops for metal and textiles. Smaller villages on the plains focused on farming and livestock, and some villages almost exclusively specialized in mining and metalwork. That means that there was an integrated economic system based on trade among villages, probably with an asymmetrical relationship in which the large settlements had the upper hand. And there is also evidence of long-distance trade, since archaeologists found ivory from African and Asian elephants. Technological advances spurred economic and demographic growth, as the isotope analysis has suggested that some areas use irrigation methods for cultivating legumes, and the production and use of metal tools for agricultural and other tasks multiplied exponentially. However, in the early Bronze Age, bronze played a minor role, and it was mostly used for personal ornaments rather than in productive activities. The Argaric culture evolved from the Los Millares culture, showing increased social stratification, rectangular housing, and distinct burial customs. These burials from around 1950 BC reveal hereditary roles and clear social classes, hinting at the development of chiefdoms with hereditary elites, which are less formalized political entities compared to states. However, the traditional notion of Argaric elites as a warrior class isn't supported by evidence. This can be deduced because they did not use swords, but rather clubs and daggers, and because out of more than 150 skeletons from the period studied, not many injuries are attributable to violence. Warfare may have been ritualistic, possibly limited to small-scale regulated combat, as it happened to the Chamorros of the Mariana Islands that I studied in the Spanish version of the show, and if you want me to do an episode about them, please let me know in the comment section. In the Argaric culture, people were usually buried alone, under their homes or close to the settlement's walls. The rich grave goods found in some of these burials differentiated the elite from the rest of the people. Interestingly, double graves sometimes occurred, usually with a man and a woman who were not related by blood, very likely a married couple that might also represent political alliances. Double burials with children or a mother and her newborn daughter in her arms have also been found, indicating that, unfortunately, she died in a complicated childbirth. Since men had more family members buried nearby than women, that indicates that in the Argaric society, inheritance followed the father's line, and women joined their husbands' families. In the late Argaric period between 1750 and 1550 BC, signs of growing inequality emerge, and there are some indications of the arrival of external elites at some sites. This leads me to the most interesting part of the Argaric wall, the question of its political organization and inequality. Before 1750 BC, the Argaric civilization was run by chiefdoms, but later there is evidence suggesting that a state or several states may have formed, controlling a wide area's farming output. The Argaric state proposed by archaeologist Vicente Llull was not based on temples, palaces, or writings, but on a model of economic exploitation and physical and ideological violence, with some families able to accumulate food, metals, control water, and mobilize people. From 1750 BC, big granaries and cereal grinding stones pop up. We observe a standardized material culture and burials, and a barley-only agriculture and identical herding practices spread over hundreds of kilometers in the southeast, regardless of local ecological conditions. Big building projects from this time, like water storage systems, suggest a powerful group was calling the shots, maybe with forced labor. A spike in head injuries among men in the late Argaric period could point to a violent conquest and local resistance. Even in burials, it's possible to see that resistance, since some Argaric communities consciously reused old burial sites and made collective burials without flashy grave goods, perhaps as a protest against the growing inequality of the Argaric civilization. there was an increase in child mortality due to poverty, diseases, and malnutrition, and welfare only worsened for the servile classes while extractive elites continued to accumulate wealth. Economic growth happened, but that was mainly through a more intensive use of labor, which included the colonization of less productive lands. Social inequality was one of the most outstanding features of Argaric society, as it is reflected in their burials, diet, and in who had access to metal goods. This was a socio-economic and political model by no means beneficial to many of the people subjected to that power, as I already described in the section on the origins of states. But around 1550 BC, the Argaric civilization collapsed. Half of the large settlements were abandoned, and those left changed completely, while all the tiny settlements disappeared as many people migrated out of southeastern Iberia. The old ways of showing off wealth in burials vanished. Life got simpler and more community-focused, and people again diversified more their crops and diet. Researchers have been struck by how one of the most politically and economically developed societies in Bronze Age Europe, like El Argar, collapsed so suddenly. But if you think about it, it's not so surprising. The Minoan eruption that occurred on a Greek island around 1620 BC could have influenced droughts and other environmental problems in the last decades of the Argaric culture. Paleobotanic studies have revealed significant deforestation because they needed more arable land to cultivate barley, the cereal demanded as taxes by the Argaric elites. This over-reliance on a single crop proved to be fatal. Crop failures may have been the catalyst, but violence seems like the biggest reason for the collapse of the Argaric civilization. Many settlements were burned down around a specific date, 1550 BC, suggesting widespread conflict. The intense social tensions within El Argar's deeply unequal society, potentially exacerbated by forced labor or slavery, ultimately erupted. The Argaric civilization may be yet another example from a long list of systems of exploitation and inequality that collapse under their own weight through a violent uprising of the oppressed.
The verdict!
This is the first episode with the section The Verdict, which serves to give my reflections, thoughts, or to pose questions for you about a topic related to the episode. I believe that the history of the Argaric civilization offers a powerful reflection on the inherent dangers of deeply unequal societies. The accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few, as opposed to a majority that sees itself growing poorer under the established political and socio-economic system, creates a breeding ground for discontent and unrest. In the Argaric world, this imbalance could have been the main cause of its sudden disappearance, as the Argaric civilization was like a house of cards. From the outside, it seemed a solid and resplendent structure, the most developed on the peninsula at its time. But in reality, the structure was very fragile and susceptible to collapse at the slightest disturbance. It is not difficult to draw parallels between the Argaric world and the current economic system. In a world where globalization has the positive effect of reducing inequalities between countries and lifting many people out of extreme poverty, but also has the negative effect of widening the gap between rich and poor within all countries, these tensions over growing economic inequality exist. When people see that economic growth doesn't benefit everyone, or worse, that the working class is actually losing ground, it sows seeds of discontent. These feelings can fuel extremist politics, protests, and even revolutions in dire cases. The story of El Argar is not just a story of the past, but a warning for the future. That a system that favors the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few and neglects or exploits a majority is like a ticking time bomb. And with that, the verdict ends. That's all for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, drop a comment, and share it around. It really helps the show grow. If you are new here, don't forget to subscribe to New History of Spain on podcast directories like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube, where you will find more episodes in a more pop history style. If you want to support my work and enjoy perks like early access to my content or a shout-out, consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/newhistoryspain. And for now, you can keep up to date with new content by joining the Discord server and X-Twitter profile. And by the way, at the time of this recording, I'm offering an English to Spanish translation service on Fiverr. Links in the description below. The next episode of the chronological series will cover the Phoenician and Greek colonization and the Tartessian civilization. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and thank you for tuning in.